Hi, this is 102. Hope all is well. Here's part two of Intro to Crop Production, of course, courtesy to Cameron Pittelcow, who could not do the presentations this year. A quick review. Photosynthesis is the driving force behind our crop production systems. It's important to remember this, and a major part of our goal is to focus our understanding of photosynthesis and the underlying biology in order to maximize our yields, and this requires consideration of several aspects of the environment surrounding the biology. So it's biology plus management, and depending on what part of the world you're in and what technology you have available to you, you might do a considerably different job out there. There is a process. The process does repeat upon itself from season to season. We're going to cover the second half here. We'll start from here and move all the way down to the end as we discuss crop production in today's discussion. So, reminding, tillage, preparing of the seed bed. Depending on the type of crop and the management practice selected, you might prepare to do a number of different things: a full, complete till, a strip till, leaving some residue behind on the surface, or you might prepare seed beds for some of tomato or eggplant or other type of crops up there where you want to plant them on top of the seed bed. It's important to consider the nutrient processes beneath. You are mining the earth of its nutrients, but plants need those nutrients. We're seeking conditions that do not limit the growth of the plant due to any specific nutrient. There's loads of benefits to tillage and preparation of the seed bed. Level land is advantageous, as we had discussed. It makes management simpler. You're also handling the residue from previous years, either to prevent seeds or to allow your crop to flourish in a clean space. You're also preventing weeds, and especially in the case of beds, you're shaping the soil in ways that benefit the crop. Let's talk about seeds now then. Crop seeds in our current agricultural system, they're really quite fragile actually. They need us to protect them. They've been domesticated in such a way that they've come to rely on us to provide them the environment they need. Wild seeds, in comparison, are much more durable when it comes to dealing with a wide range of stress that might occur onto their ability to germinate, grow, and reproduce. What are the key areas that we focus on when we're trying to take care of the seeds, especially when we're trying to get them to germinate? Well, we're looking for the right moisture content in the soil, a reasonable temperature, and access to oxygen, those plants, and even at the seed stage, they are respiring and they need access to oxygen. How have we gone about planting seeds? Well, you can see those potato planters up on the top right from ages ago. Most typically, you prepare a furrow for your plant to grow in. You can see it pretty well there. A nice little ditch along the length of where you want to plant, and then you prepare your seed, in this case, seed potatoes, and space them out. You put them to the right depth, and eventually you cover them. You cover the furrow. This can be done in a mechanized format, but it also is often done, well, even today, depending on what part of the world you're in, by hand. The main alternative to a furrow planting would be broadcast seeding. Here's an automated version, a mechanized version of doing that. If you've ever dropped fertilizer in your yard, weed killer in your yard, a machine like this is just a larger scale of it, but the mechanism is quite similar. Down here you see the transfer case causes a platform here to rotate, and there's a regulator that allows seed to drop onto that platform, and that platform rotates and throws the seed. The next alternative to that is broadcast seeding. You might do it by hand. This is in the developing world even today. All you're trying to do is get a reasonably even coating of the seed across the landscape. You might use some very high seeding rates for this. Within an acre, many tens of thousands of seeds, maybe hundreds of thousands of seeds per acre. In a mechanized format, we have planters and drills, two different types of machines that both are putting seeds down. The planter generally is dealing with a larger seed, but it is very precise in the space, in the depth. You're probably dealing with wider rows. Corn and soybeans are great examples. Those high seed rates, even corn and soybean, in some instances, you are getting into the tens of thousands, many tens of thousands of seeds per acre. Much higher rates with the seed drill, though. It's a smaller seed, narrow rows. Wheat and rice are great examples. Irrigation is next. Plants need water. That water allows those leaves to expand. Here's your biology. There are organs within your leaves, or within your plant cells, I should say, called vacuoles. They fill up with fluid, generally water, but it could be other fluids as well. And as they gain fluid within those vacuoles, the molecule or the cells themselves expand, allowing the leaves and the other plant parts to expand into a turgid state, allowing it to stand up straight, to expand those leaves, expose them to sunlight, right? So that allows CO2 uptake and photosynthesis to drive forward. If you come to my office, you'll often see plants that look like this because I don't water them sufficiently. Managing water. In order to manage water, you need to think about the soil and the quality of the soil. Soil is not just soil, of course. It's a mixture of many different things. The truly mineralized matter has been broken down many times until it is really just mineral that is left. That makes up about a little less than half of the soil that you're talking about. There's still a significant portion of organic matter on its way to being broken down to its mineral precursors. Outside of those, that makes up about half of a typical soil. The rest is air and water. Air and water. And that air is critical. That's where the oxygen will lie, but so is the water, as you know. So where does that go? How do we partition between air and water within your systems? Well, this is a nice model way to look at it. The particles of soil themselves, they pile up in various ways, but they don't necessarily fill up all the voids. There is space between those particles, and that's where the air, that's where the water begins to lie, in between those particles. So once we say that the soil itself is completely saturated, that the water is sticking to it, you could squeeze water out of it. That's this case here on the far left. As you move to the right, it's drying out. A capacity here where you can no longer squeeze the water out with the force of gravity. It still has some air pores space. You can dry it out a little further, a typical case, until you get to a point where the plant itself starts to wilt. Those are the plants in my office. Surface irrigation is one means in which we allow the plant to gain its moisture. We bring water in onto the surface, in fact, filling the entire space between the two rows of plants. The water moves into the soil based on how wet that soil is previously, and based on the particle size of the soil. You might be able to move that water into the soil matrix a little faster, a little slower. Larger particles, sands, allow that to happen more readily. Smaller particles, clays, do not. We might also use center pivot irrigation. In the U.S., this is probably the most typical way we see it done. A machine with an axis point in the center. With water pressure, we can actually drive these wheels. Sometimes it's with electricity. but you can move that center pivot and make it rotate around in order to drop water onto the plant, and resulting in these interesting patterns that you'll see from the sky. Irrigation efficiency, you have to think about it as a relatively low efficiency process. So the amount of water that's actually used by the crop relative to the amount supplied is relatively small. Okay, we seek to improve this efficiency on a regular basis, but these are the most typical ways that we do it currently. Runoff, water just simply moves down gradient, moves away from the plant before the plant can actually capture it, before the soil can actually uptake it. Or in areas where percolation and movement into the soil matrix does occur, it can percolate right past the plant, beyond the roots, and are no longer available to the plant. In areas with high sunlight irradiation from the sun, it may evaporate right up again off the surface, causing lack of uniformity across the system. Next step, weed and pest and disease control. It's interesting, right? We spend so much time talking about that environment that we're creating for the plant, but not only have we created a great plant environment for the plant to grow, it turns out that lots of other things can enjoy that environment as well. And this includes weed plants, pests, and various types of disease that can attack the plant. So it is probably worthwhile to be thinking about, since the conditions are so ripe for biological activity, that indeed the plant itself is under attack on a regular basis, under attack at all times. Pests and of various kinds are using that environment to help complete their own life cycle. They don't care whether or not there's a crop there or not. They're trying to survive. But the trouble is that the pest becomes in conflict with our personal agricultural goals with regards to increasing yields, increasing profitability of the systems that we're dealing with. And ultimately, pests become detrimental to the system. Here's an example. A pathogen. This is a fungal disease in wheat. We call this stem rust. You can see here the outward display of the fungus. This is the fruiting body, most likely, of the fungus, although I'm not an expert in this particular area. But when it happens, this particular disease can readily impact yield, of course. And the reason being is that your plant otherwise may look reasonably healthy. You'll even get seed heads on the top. You can see one right here of the plant. But it's extracting nutrients from the stem of these wheat plants, and the seed itself suffers at the top. The seed itself suffers at the top, making them shrivel. They'll be very small in size, if they exist at all. Here's a pest. These guys over here look like little mollusks. Well, that's exactly what they are. These are snails that are growing up on the plant. You can eat these guys. That's interesting. But they can spread through various waterways. People do grow them then. So you could imagine some aquacultural systems where people are growing these things, but they spread into rice fields. And they can be a pretty serious pest, particularly in rice fields that we maintain flooded. And if you look carefully, you can see them in many different parts of this image. They're not as big as they might look on the top right there. Here's a weed. This is a parasitic weed. It is stealing nutrients and water. So what is happening right now is that it's effectively consuming the nutrients in the water even before they arrive at the primary plant. This is corn pictured here. It's a pretty parasitic weed in Africa. And in some instances, since it does so much damage even before the primary crop is up, you might lose the whole crop potentially, even before you realize it's there, before you can see it. So how do we attack these things? Well, you might imagine we spend quite a lot of time using chemical controls. in many different instances. And you can see down on the bottom right, some parts of the world, these are people walking through the field spraying. I wouldn't want to be downwind of the guy on the right there, but that's what it looks like is happening. Um, it can be cost effective if your alternative is to go and manually pick out those mollusks or to try to find the weeds that you can't even see. The competition between chemical control and the amount of time that you would invest in order to handle these weeds, pests, parasites manually is really pretty, it's really strongly benefiting your chemical controls. So, and mechanistically, of course, you can see how we handle it. Again, you drive the tractor through the field. This tractor is equipped with a tanker and sprayers in order to drop whatever. I don't know if that's herbicide or pesticide or fungicide, but it's one of those in order to try to avoid it. Again, same constraints as before. You can only drive that machine into the field while you can get over the crop. All right, there's no crop pictured here, so it's relatively easy right now. But if something happens later in the life cycle, that could be a challenge. So you can imagine then we do focus on early management, getting out in the field well before the plant gets too high. And I really enjoy a figure like this one because you can imagine the pests that we need to be considering or targeting at any given time really kind of depend on what part of the plant is being exposed at any given time. So if there's something that is specifically targeting the kernels really late, it's probably, in many instances, for a very tall crop at least, it might be very difficult to manage something like that. At that point, you are probably talking about an aerial application, if anything at all. There's costs associated with those. At harvest time, we run through, the plant is physiologically mature. Ideally, we try to let that crop dry down before we harvest it, mainly because humid crop, a wet, a moist crop, has some impact in processing later, particularly in milling when it's wet. So many of our crops are naturally annual crops, and so therefore, once they've reached their maximum yield, they move into a period of senescence where the plant itself is beginning to die. And as it's dying, it's drying because photosynthetic action ceases. And we're not bringing more carbon dioxide, more water up into the plant. And that ends up being a beneficial process as long as you don't wait too long. As you wait longer and longer, your crop is exposed to the environment and all the pests in the environment, and hopefully you don't get to the point where you're risking some damage either through loss or weather or something else. Depending on the situation, we have to manage the residues that are left over. There are a significant amount of residues for most every agricultural crop, and the reason being is that we don't eat the whole plant. There are always materials, the plant grows, a portion of it is the edible portion or the processable portion, and then the other portion is left over, it's straw. Depending on the part of the world you live in, you're going to handle this material differently. Around here, we try to leave as much of it on the field as we can. It protects the soil. Well, I shouldn't say necessarily here. In many parts of the U.S., we do leave it behind as a soil protectant, as a mulch to protect the soil. There are parts of the world, and actually very close to here, sometimes that soil is so thick and rich, or the land itself is so flat that we don't necessarily worry too much about erosion or loss of soil. You might start to recycle that material in by digging it under. In order to allow it to start its degradation process a little bit more quickly by exposing it to the microorganisms in the soil. There are parts of the world, however, where burning of the soil is the primary way to go through it. Quickly releases the minerals back into the soil. If populated areas are farther away, the smoke is not a problem. This is becoming regulated more and more as our world becomes more and more urban. You could also pick it up. You could bale it. In many instances, these are rich feeds that can be brought to livestock, or that could be used in other forms, other ways. So, in order to maximize your yields, it is worthwhile to be thinking about all the processes that we have discussed until now, ranging all the way from those nutrients to some of the ways that we bring environmental factors in order to increase the productivity. Somewhere along that chain, whether it's by our own management approaches or by environmental factors like weather on any given year, something is going to limit the growth of the crop. It's a complex challenge, you would say, in order to keep all of these factors high. But ultimately, you might expect that your yield is eventually controlled and limited by whichever one of those constraints is tightest. In this particular picture, it's a nutrient. Nitrogen, perhaps, is our limiting factor. It is worthwhile to think about that. There's a chemical law by Liebig, the law of the minimum, which drives this factor, and is probably something that we end up utilizing or keeping in the back of our mind through management as we seek ways to avoid those limitations. Okay. So, what are some of the current benefits of our conventional approaches to agriculture? Especially in the developed world, we are really often seeking to minimize our labor in order to improve our efficiency out there. Our labor costs can be quite high, and especially as you try to increase the amount of manual labor associated with farming. A mechanized system tends to allow us to avoid some of those labor inefficiencies, but in order to justify the cost of these machineries, you need to have larger and larger and larger tracts of land. We're seeking what we call economies of scale when we're running these types of systems, and that's particularly important. If you can keep the yields high, however, you will feed many, many people. I've heard figures very recently that suggest a developed world farmer feeds more than 1,000 people. And even a developing world farmer still feeds many hundreds of people, 100 people possibly. So you are seeking to leverage both the economies of scale and labor efficiencies in order to pass that benefit on to the rest of society. If you do it well, weather doesn't get in the way, theoretically you can make a pretty decent profit, particularly on good lands. So it's important then to be thinking about how all of these factors impact our food and agricultural system as we go forward. So a tip for you all, since we can't ask questions in this format, I'd suggest you think about adding comments. I'll do my best to keep an eye on the YouTube page if that helps you, and I'll answer questions. And of course, you can email me, and if I can't help you, I'll email Dr. Pittelcow, although if I'm not mistaken, his internet access is going to be relatively limited. But we'll do the best we can. We got a whole department of crop sciences to get you some questions. Thanks a lot. I hope this is helpful for you.